my fifth and final argument for the superiority of Protestantism in Ignatius relates to Ignatius's take on apostolic succession, namely that Ignatius's view of succession is far closer to the Reformed and Lutheran perspectives than it is with Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, because Ignatius describes presbyters and not bishops as presiding in the place of the apostles. Now, for the record, I acknowledged in my first video that I don't believe Ignatius speaks directly of apostolic succession in any of his letters, at least in the way that apostolic succession is commonly understood in today's day and age. Now, despite this, I nonetheless decided upon putting forward this argument, again, not because of my own affirmations per se, but because of the many Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox who insist that Ignatius is a strong witness to their unique institution's understanding of apostolic succession. Thus, in responding to these claims, if we are going to evaluate how Ignatius would have understood the concept of apostolic succession, we should therefore first evaluate the criteria for what would have constituted apostolic succession in his letters. Apostolic succession proper, in simplest terms, refers to the succession of the office of the apostles. Therefore, in order to determine to whom the succession of the apostles belongs, we need to first determine who specifically presides in the place of the apostles. As I demonstrated in my previous video from both the Catechism of the Catholic Church and the Confession of Disitheus, both Rome and the East affirm that bishops directly preside in the place of the apostles, and therefore possess their succession. The office of presbyter shares an apostolic succession, but only because of its union with the office of bishops, not because they possess it inherently. However, when observing the letters of Ignatius, we find that he never describes the bishops as occupying the place of the apostles. On the contrary, on numerous occasions, he refers to the office of presbyter as that which presides in the place of the apostles. Therefore, were we to argue for apostolic succession from the writings of Ignatius, based on a most straightforward reading of his letters, we would conclude that his view of apostolic succession is one that is primarily traced through presbyters, not through bishops. A common objection that I receive to this argument is that, although Ignatius describes presbyters as presiding in the place of the apostles, he also describes bishops as presiding in the place of God, demonstrating that Ignatius clearly had a much higher view of the bishop than he did of the presbyters. Therefore, if we were to affirm apostolic succession through presbyters, because presbyters preside in the place of the apostles, and God is infinitely greater than the apostles, and bishops preside in the place of God, then we should therefore be willing to acknowledge the superiority of bishops, even as it relates to apostolic succession. In response, I would simply raise a question for us to ponder on. How literal are we to take Ignatius' description of the bishops presiding in the place of God? If we're talking about apostolic succession, after all, are we to affirm that God somehow possesses succession? If bishops preside in the place of God, does this therefore mean that bishops possess perpetual infallibility in the same way that God does? Ignatius' description of bishops presiding in the place of God does not directly speak to succession, especially as it relates to the place of the apostles, and especially when he describes another office, that of the presbyters, as already presiding in such a place. Another common objection that I received is that Ignatius is a clear witness to the monepiscopal structure of church hierarchy, which in and of itself supposedly nullifies any concept of Protestantism from the start. 3 responses to this. First, even if we were to concede that Ignatius affirmed the monepiscopacy, that would not contradict Protestantism, as Anglicans and some Lutherans affirm exactly this. Second, again, even if we were to concede that Ignatius did affirm the monepiscopacy, that would not necessitate the exact view of apostolic succession as that of Rome and the East. But third, and most relevant to the point, whether or not Ignatius truly did affirm the monepiscopacy is a topic that is up for debate amongst scholars and theologians. The well-known 19th century Reformed theologian Herman Bavinck, for example, states that in Ignatius' day, the term bishop referred to an office bearer who presided in the local church and did not possess any authority outside of it. These bishops, likewise, relevant to our topic of discussion, did not bear apostolic succession. But many here, I'm sure, would object and insist that, of course, Bavinck would say such things because he's Reformed after all. But such objectors may be interested to know that this is affirmed not only by Reformed theologians like Bavinck, but even both Anglican and Roman Catholic scholars. Alistair Stewart, for example, who himself is an Anglican, states on multiple occasions in his book, Original Bishops, that Ignatius was not a monarchical bishop, nor did he affirm a monepiscopal view of church hierarchy. Likewise, Raymond Edward Brown, himself a Roman Catholic, states that Ignatius's view of bishops and presbyters were offices that pertain specifically to local congregations, offices whose functions could be compared to the way a pastor and his curates exercise authority in a one parish town, again suggesting that Ignatius did not affirm the monepiscopacy. David J. Downs, in the Cambridge Companion to the Apostolic Fathers, describes the office of bishop as one of a household manager who intimately participated in the local church's liturgy. Bishops would lead local congregations in prayer, they would preach, they would baptize, administer the Eucharist, along with many other functions within the local church. And even some scholars who believe Ignatius did affirm a monepiscopal view of church hierarchy simultaneously admit that Ignatius did not affirm the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox view of apostolic succession. A notable example of this is Roman Catholic scholar Francis Sullivan, who states the following: while Ignatius of Antioch is a major witness to the early development of the episcopate, he offers no support for the thesis that bishops receive their authority from Christ as successor to the apostles. He did not exclude it, but neither did he invoke it as an argument for what he so passionately promoted: the unity of the local church under the authority of its bishop. I say all this to point out that it cannot merely be assumed that Ignatius is a witness to the concept of a monarchical bishop. Though he certainly distinguishes between bishops and presbyters, there is a real debate as to what his view of these offices are and the relationship to one another is. In this way, the Reformed and non-Episcopalian Lutheran articulations of church government cannot be ruled out from Ignatius' thought. But even if Ignatius, again, did affirm the monepiscopacy, that does not therefore necessitate the view of apostolic succession as put forward by Rome in the East. To conclude once again with my argument, apostolic succession refers to the succession of the office of the apostles. Ignatius describes presbyters, not bishops, as presiding in the place of the apostles. Therefore, Ignatius' language supports the apostolic succession of presbyters over that of bishops, were he to speak of succession at all.